Good morning, and Joe, thank you for inviting me to be part of this great event. A tremendous credit to you. 29 years, they say. It doesn't quite show. It's always a challenge to come number 3 on the speaker list, because you find that as you listen to the first 2 speakers, that they probably said most of what you were going to say. They've used all your slides. I think listening to them, I was in total agreement with most of what both Padraig and Paul said. But what struck me was that it sounded rather as though they were looking at a wide range of alternative ways of meeting Ireland's energy needs in the future, and they were doing this in a fairly leisurely way. They were choosing what they thought was best, and what they thought was best was sustainable energy, so they were moving in that direction. The message I have for you is that we haven't really got any choice. In fact, we haven't got any choice at all. Our reliance on fossil fuels, and on oil in particular, is going to have to come to an end. And it's going to have to come to an end very quickly. I'm going to try and explain to you why I believe that oil supply is probably at a maximum worldwide right now. We may already have passed the peak in oil supply. If we haven't passed it, we're within a few years of hitting it. And projections which show that we're going to move slowly away from our thirst for oil just aren't going to work. So we've talked already several times about Ireland's oil usage. We're a thirsty nation as far as oil is concerned. Our tiger is gone, and I suspect that very rapidly our access to cheap, easy oil is going to go too. We've heard already several times that as far as primary energy sources are concerned, that Ireland is heavily dependent on fossil fuels, on oil and gas. 90% of our primary energy is imported. Most of it is oil and gas. Our transport, virtually all of it, depends on oil. And we're big users of transport in Ireland. We haven't thought a lot, we haven't invested a lot in good public transport. Our cities, particularly the Dublin area, have been developed in a way which forces people to use their private cars to get to work. We use our cars more than most other people. We drive them further, and this is something which is going to cause us big problems. Our electricity, we've heard quite a lot about electricity from the last 2 speakers. We've heard how we are moving towards sustainable sources, but we're moving very slowly. We may be increasing rapidly the amount of electricity that we generate from wind. I think we're going up something of the order of 20% a year, but it still only makes up a tiny proportion of our total available energy. So we can't sit back and hope that oil is going to continue to provide the major source of our primary energy in the future. And let's see a little bit of why. It's not news that Ireland is a thirsty nation. Joe last night demonstrated that in the bar. But that's not what I've come to from West Cork. That's not what I've come from West Cork to tell you. We use a lot more oil than most other people that are around. Not as much as the US. This graph here shows consumption, rather strange numbers, US gallons per head per day. But we see that even though the US at almost 3 gallons per head per day is a sort of world leader, Ireland is way ahead of most other industrial countries. And certainly in terms of average consumption over the world, we're something like 10 times as thirsty as the world on average. We use a lot of oil. Our oil usage has been slowly, steadily increasing over the last decade. So has our gas usage. A little bit of a fall off in the last year, but I don't think that's got anything to do with our wish to use oil. It's got more to do with our ability to pay for it and a falling off in GNP. So it doesn't look as though we're a country which is really ready for a situation where oil is going to be in short supply. There are as many estimates of oil demand and hydrocarbon demand in the future as there are grains of sand on a beach. These particular slides come from ExxonMobil. Now, Exxon as a company is not a believer in this concept of an oil supply peak. There's a range of views among the world's big oil companies as to when a peak might come or whether it will come at all. Exxon is one of the most vocal in saying that we're many, many years away from a peak. But these are demand estimates which Exxon published a short time ago. And they bear out the comment that Paul made. I think that the level of demand per unit of GDP, or whatever way you like to measure it, in the Western world, in North America and in Europe, is essentially flat. There's still some growth in demand for oil and gas, but it's not very large. The big increase is coming from China and India. So it's their expanding economies which are driving world demand growth. Their economies are expanding. They're also the economies which are least efficient in using energy. China, India use very roughly twice as much energy per unit of GDP as do the US or Europe. So as their economies expand, there really is a huge increase in hydrocarbon from them. Sadly, if you look at the right-hand graph, a large proportion of that increased demand from China and India goes on transportation. You've all read, I'm sure, about the motor car that's just become available in India, which I think sells for €2,000. You've probably seen that car sales in China in the first quarter of this year were up something like 47% on the previous year, which was a slightly depressed one. But all the same, we're seeing a huge increase in car usage, particularly in India and China, and that's driving this demand for more hydrocarbon. So the demand is there, increasing at something like 1 to 1.5% a year. Now, maybe this increase in demand will be slowed down by higher prices, but it's been remarkably inelastic over the last few decades. So the demand appears to be there, a demand for more and more oil, more and more gas each year. If we look at the way in which that demand is likely to be met, according to ExxonMobil, and I think most analysts would come up with something fairly similar, we see oil making up a significant part of that increased world energy demand. We see oil, gas, and coal on that left-hand picture there. And then the top yellow band is things other than oil, gas, and coal. And that other band then is split out in the middle, and you can see the contribution that is expected to come from hydro, some growth, but not as a percentage of usage, absolute growth. Nuclear again, some growth. Biomass, some growth. And then up the top, that tiny little yellow slice is wind and solar. If you look at the right-hand graph, then that splits out the wind and solar. So the vertical scale on each of these graphs is quite different. Now, you can see from that right-hand graph that wind and solar energy availability is increasing dramatically, but it's increasing from an incredibly low base. And all these, percentage increases that we read about, 20% a year, 30% a year, they really don't add up to very much, even over 10, 15, 20 years, given the very, very low base from which we're starting. So they will help the way we're working now. Our wind and our solar will certainly help, but they're still tiny, their contribution, compared with the contribution we require from hydrocarbon. Now, when we come then to look at supply rather than demand, people sort of ignore the finite nature of oil fields, or our oil endowment worldwide. Driving in from Derry yesterday evening, I could see turf bogs along both sides of the road. It was clear that these were pretty well depleted. There was still some cutting going on, but you could see over the years that people had been cutting and cutting and cutting, and the bogs regenerate very, very slowly. So our harvesting of the bogs has led to a situation where they're close to being depleted. We don't see what's happening in an oil field. If we did, I think we probably would be pretty frightened right now. Oil, most of the oil that we produce was laid down probably about 90 to 130 million years ago. It doesn't take that long to make oil, but most of the oil that we're producing is coming from that long ago. Oil forms very, very slowly, perhaps over a period of 100,000 years or more. So there's no way that the world's reserve, the world's endowment of oil, is going to increase so that we can keep on farming it. There's a finite amount there, and when it's gone, it's gone. Now, if we look at the oil-producing countries around the world, we find that in most producing countries, we've got to the stage where oil fields have passed the point at which we can maintain their production rates. As an oil field is produced, oil is withdrawn from it, the pressure in that field falls, water moves in to replace the oil that's come out of the ground. When roughly 50 to 55% of the reserves in a field have been produced, we find the production rate the field can support declines. So even though there's lots of oil left there to be produced, it will only come out of the ground at a lower and lower rate. And once a field goes into decline, once we pass this point where its original production rate can't be maintained, the production rate that we can achieve falls off very quickly. It can be as high as 15 to 18%. We can, in the short term, we can make investments in the field which may reduce that decline rate, but they won't last. This change in decline rate won't last very long and will be followed by a period of even faster decline. Again, around the world, we're finding that our ability to find new oil is disappearing. I'll show you some data in a few moments, but the oil discovery rate around the world has been falling since about 1970. So we can't rely, it seems, on new discoveries to replace the declining oil fields. And neither, it seems, can we rely on new technology. The fields that we're producing are becoming more and more complicated geologically. They're in deeper water, they're deeper under the ground. The new technology that we acquire is just about able to deal with the new problems that we're meeting. So neither new discoveries nor new technology seem likely to give us the possibility of extending or increasing our existing supply. And finally, just on this slide, the economic events of the last 12 to 18 months have been disastrous as far as the development of new field capacity is concerned. It takes roughly, on average, 6 to 7 years to get from the discovery of a field to first production from that field. And people won't make investments in new fields, in new facilities, if they are not confident of the oil price that's going to apply when that field comes on production. And the effect of the uncertainty in oil price over the last 12 months has been to make investors pull back from decisions that they might otherwise have made in field development. We've seen a lot of field developments postponed. Now that doesn't have any short-term, or it has very little short-term effect on supply, but it's going to have a dramatic effect on supply in 5-10 years' time. This slide tries to show that what I've been talking about in terms of fields maturing, their production rates declining as they age. If we look at the existing fields in production worldwide and predict how their performance, how their production is likely to be over the next few decades, we can expect decline rates, despite investment in technology, to be something like 5 to 6%. So if we take the production capacity that we have now, decline that at about 5%, and then we take the demand curve, the area in red there shows the amount of new production we must bring on stream in order to meet demand over the next decade or 2 decades. And you can see that we have to replace something like 60% of our existing production just to stay in the same place as we are now, supply-wise, and then add new production over and above that to meet increased demand. So a huge task facing the oil industry and a huge new investment. Part of the problem in persuading politicians, persuading people from other industries that urgent action is needed to ensure that we have enough energy country by country in the future, despite this change in oil availability, is uncertainty over the world's oil reserves. You might think that with oil being such an important part of our lives, every part of our lives, that somebody somewhere around the world has a really good handle on what remaining oil reserves are. Well, amazing though it is, that person doesn't exist. There's tremendous debate over how much oil reserves, how large the oil reserves which the world has really are. None of the people who have access to parts of the database needed to do an accurate assessment are prepared to share this data. The big international oil companies, the IOCs, and the other big independent oil companies are constrained about discussing their reserves in detail by various financial agencies. I don't think they want to discuss them anyway. A company's reserves are generally treated as being highly confidential, but certainly there's no open discussion worldwide as to what the basis for estimates of reserves from various IOCs are. The national oil companies, the companies which control production in countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Indonesia, and so on, are even more secretive. Most of these countries have, or the vast majority of these countries, have no significant natural resources other than oil. And they are very, very secretive just about what their national reserves are. Partly, I guess, because there's a matter of pride involved, but more importantly, because the OPEC countries share out production quotas based, among other things, on remaining reserves. So if you can talk up your reserves, you can possibly get hold of a higher OPEC production quota. The OPEC countries, the NOCs, are even more secretive than the IOCs. And over the last few decades, as the balance in world production and world reserves has shifted from the international oil companies to the NOCs, the lack of clarity over remaining reserves has become even worse. 40 years ago, 1970s, the international oil companies controlled roughly 70% of production and reserves. The OPEC countries about 30%. Now the situation is roughly reversed. Something like 70% of remaining oil reserves are probably in the OPEC countries. So we don't have good reserve data worldwide. We've got various agencies which attempt to sift through the data that's available, come up with estimates. The US EIA is one. Ireland is one of the countries which set up the International Energy Agency, the IEA, which again produces estimates of remaining reserves. But until very recently, the IEA's estimates, which are used by most of the member countries to guide their energy policy, have been, in my view, highly inaccurate and very optimistic in terms of reserves. The IEA, in their last report in November 2008, almost totally reversed their position on oil supply, admitted that we were heading towards a peak, and although I don't think they've come quite as far on the pessimistic side as I think they should have, they give every indication of coming up with more realistic estimates over the next few years. Now, I'm sure that sitting in the hall you can't really see the numbers in this graph. I don't really intend you to. These show estimates of reserves for 5 or 6 areas around the world, as reported by various agencies, BP, another oil company, AGIP, the German government agency, and 2 technical journals which specialize in obtaining and publishing world oil reserves. What I think you can see from those histograms is enormous variations in world oil reserve estimates. We just don't know. There's nobody who knows precisely how much oil is left in the world. And without an estimate of how much oil is left, you can't come up with realistic estimates of supply. Now, I've said that the international oil companies are not particularly helpful in coming up with data which would lead us to better estimates. But one of the biggest problems are the reserves of the OPEC countries. What are they? And this slide, lots of numbers, but basically it's showing the reserves reported by 7 of the principal OPEC countries, going back to the early 1980s and running into the early 2000s. The significant thing about it is that in the early 1980s, most of these countries had only very recently taken over responsibility for their oil industries. Abu Dhabi, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela. Well, Venezuela had nationalized its industry quite a long time before, but the others, the big IOCs, Exxon, BP, Shell, had essentially run the industry in Abu Dhabi, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, until the early to late 1970s. So there are lots of people around in the IOCs who had worked on reserve calculations in these countries and who could vouch for the reasonableness of the reserve estimates shown for 1980, 81, 82, 83. I prepared the reserve numbers for Iran in 1978, so I know what that number for Iran is roughly correct. I'd worked in Kuwait and Abu Dhabi previously. I've every reason to believe those numbers are correct. But what we see going through the 1980s, first of all in 1985, we see Kuwait increase its reserves by about 40% from one year to the next. Now, I can assure you that if Kuwait had discovered a 26 billion barrel oil field in 1984, the rest of the world would have known about it. It would have been one of the world's biggest oil fields. There were lots of people from BP, including friends of mine working in Kuwait in 1984-85, lots of international service companies. Nothing happened, technically, in Kuwait in 1985 which justifies that increase. If you're a suspicious person, you might think perhaps it had something to do with OPEC quotas, that Kuwait wanted to increase its OPEC production quota. I don't know whether that's the truth or not, but I do know that technically there's no reason why their reserves should have increased by 40%. We wait 2 or 3 years, and then we see the response from the other OPEC countries. Abu Dhabi triples its reserves. Iran more or less doubles them. Iraq doubles them. These things can't happen. I mean, we understand oil field behavior pretty well. We can take the data from an oil field. We can analyze how that field is likely to behave in the future. These sort of huge changes in performance just don't happen. It would seem, if to anyone looking on from outside, that those increases in the late 1980s came about because of Kuwait's increase earlier in the decade, and then were followed a few years later by a huge change in Saudi Arabia and in Venezuela. I don't believe that those numbers are meaningful. I believe that the OPEC countries added about 300 billion barrels to their reserves inappropriately in the late 1980s. Now, 300 billion barrels is about, depending on whose numbers you look at, is about 20 to 25% of the world's remaining oil. That's a huge change, a huge uncertainty introduced into our estimates of how much oil the world has left. And it's this sort of thing which makes predicting future oil supply so difficult. Now, in the absence of any individual company or any world agency coming up with reasonable numbers, groups of people outside the industry have tried to gather up data and come up with impartial, unbiased numbers. And one of the most significant of these efforts has been led by a group in Ireland. Colin Campbell, who's a retired industry geologist based in West Cork, has led a group of people worldwide in getting together reserves numbers, sometimes acquiring these by slightly surreptitious methods, but getting a set of numbers which have a good technical basis and don't have any bias. And if we follow the work that Campbell and his colleagues have done, we come up with a pretty depressing picture. First of all, we find that we're producing roughly 5 barrels of oil for every barrel we find currently, so we're relying on the successes of the past. We come up with estimates, or we can derive estimates of how much oil is yet to be discovered, and the number I've shown here, just over 100 billion barrels, is a fraction of what many other studies have shown. It's probably about 20% or less than many other studies. If we translate these numbers into production forecasts, we find that it's likely that our conventional, what we call conventional oil, which is oil other than ultra-deep water, other than heavy oil, other than Arctic oil, the sort of oil we've relied on for our transport, our energy over the last 30, 40 years, we find that that is at or very close to a peak. There's certainly uncertainty in these numbers, but if you do the arithmetic, it looks as though the peak is going to come within the next year or two. The effect of production from deep water, from the Arctic and so on, will delay the overall peak a little bit, but it looks very much as though we're going to hit a peak in liquid hydrocarbon supply within the next 3 or 4 years, and that subsequently supply will decline at something like 2 to 3% per year. Now, this means that when you hear Padraig and Paul talking about, well, we've chosen this nice option, it's not an option. our energy supply is going to have to change dramatically in the very near term. When these numbers are produced and we discuss these sort of studies in detail, the initial response is usually something like, well, there's still loads of places around the world where there's been very little exploration. We're going to see some big discoveries yet. What about Brazil? Hasn't there been good news from there? And what about the deepwater Gulf of Mexico? Good news from there. We'll look at the exploration record in a second. I think it's highly unlikely that we're going to see many more significant big discoveries. We'll see lots of little ones, but they really don't make up for the rate at which we're producing our oil. People talk about technology. When we look at how technology has affected the performance of existing fields, and we look at the increasing complexity of our new fields, it's hard to be very optimistic about the effect that technology is going to have. Now, there's certainly a huge target out there for new technology. On average, and there's a huge variation, but on average, we recover roughly 40% of the oil in an oil field. So when we abandon a field because it's no longer economic to produce, 60% or more of the oil that was originally in place is still there. So that's a huge target for new technology, other ways in which we can get more of the oil out of an oil field. But the record suggests that as fields get more complex, as we find more of these smaller, deeper fields, our recovery efficiency may not grow very much. Unconventional sources, getting oil from oil sands, extracting oil from oil shale, coal to liquid technology, gas to liquid technology, all of these things will undoubtedly work sometime, but they're not going to work in the sort of time frame that's going to make any difference to the peak I'm talking about, nor to the decline rate in supply immediately after that peak has been reached. Many of these technologies, I'm sure, will give us significant supplies in 30, 40, 50 years' time, but not sooner than that economically. This CCS, this carbon capture and storage, if we could make CCS work economically, then that might bring about some of these technologies contributing significantly a little bit earlier. But all the indications are, to anyone who's looked at CCS in detail, is that it's going to be a long, long time before it's likely to work economically. I see some nodding from the chairwoman. I'll be quick. Discoveries. If we look at the discovery record, discovery against time, it's a bit disconcerting. Discovery rate has been declining, arguably since the 60s, but certainly since the 70s. We're finding less and less oil each year. There was a little blip in the beginning of this century, 2001, 2002, but I think it was a pretty short-term one. Since about 1980, we have been consuming more oil than we're discovering, and that can't go on. New technology, won't go into this in detail, but if we take standard ways of looking at the performance of oil fields around the world, and I've taken two very large ones here. Forties, which is one of the biggest fields in the North Sea, and Prudhoe Bay, which is the biggest field in North America. And Prudhoe Bay, incidentally, we have in the audience today Malcolm McClure, who helped find Prudhoe Bay. But these are two really big fields operated by the world's biggest oil companies. And if you look at the performance record, if you look at the way that technology has affected the performance of these fields over their lives, we see it's done virtually nothing to improve performance. What it's done is technology has overcome unexpected problems, problems we didn't expect to have before we put these fields on production, things which would have hurt our recovery. We've managed to beat back through new technology, but we haven't done better overall than we expected to do initially. The IEA prediction of future production looks initially a little bit more optimistic than the one I showed you from Colin Campbell and his colleagues. But it depends very, very largely on production from fields which have yet to be found, fields which have yet to be developed. If we take a pessimistic view on the discovery and development program over the next decade or so, then this IEA picture comes out looking very similar to the one that Campbell and his colleagues came up with. Oil price chain cuts and the recent credit crisis is delaying development of fields. It's likely to bring forward the peak. It may mean that post-peak decline is a little bit slower than it would have been, but essentially what's happened in the financial world over the last few years has hurt our future supplies. The energy gap, can we fill it? Lots of possibilities around unconventional fossils, coal with this carbon dioxide capture. Natural gas, again, we're not that far away from a peak natural gas in natural gas production. A few decades, but gas is only a short-term filler of our supply curve. Nuclear, wind, all of these things are going to deliver. Are they going to deliver in time? Final slide. This is the SEI's estimate of future demand for Ireland going out to 2020 and showing how they expect it to be met. The blue section of the slide is the oil supply they expect to see. It shows a small increase, annual increase, over this prediction period. I suggest to you that given what we know about world oil supplies, that Ireland is unlikely to have access to that volume of oil. So I think we have a very short-term problem coming at us, and one which really we're still not fully recognizing. Thank you.